Many of you know that we're in the midst of a sermon series on the 50 days of transformation. And over the last several weeks, we've looked at different key areas of health. First week, we talked about our spiritual health. Then we talked about our physical health. Third week, we talked about our mental health. And last week, we looked at our emotional health. This week, I want us to look at our relational health. Transforming your relationships. How to make your relationships better. And I want us to look at diffusing the fears that ruin relationships. And to do that, we're going to go all the way back to the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, and look at the first couple, Adam and Eve, because that's where all of the problems started. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Eve. You know the story that God created the entire universe because He wanted to create earth, because He wanted to create a sustaining environment for human beings, because God wanted a family. And if God hadn't wanted a family, He wouldn't have created the universe, but He made it so that you and I could be in His family. So He made Adam, and He put Adam in the Garden of Eden, a perfect paradise. Adam had everything he could possibly want, except the Bible says he was lonely. He noticed that animals had mates, but there was no one for Adam. And I think God did that intentionally for two reasons. He wanted Adam to realize that he would need in his own life. And second, I think God made Adam, and then He thought, you know, I could do better. And then He made Eve. Wow. Okay. So God made Adam out of the dust, out of the dirt of the earth. And so Adam was created out of dirt, and then He created woman out of Adam. And this, by the way, some have said, is why men don't mind getting dirty and women do. Because men are made of dirt. Things went along great for a long time between man and woman, Adam and Eve, because there was no sin. So there was no sadness, there was no sorrow, there was no sickness, no suffering, no deceit, no lying, no manipulating, no jealousy. None of those things were in that first relationship. They were the only couple who had a perfect relationship. The only one. Because since sin entered the world, everything else has been broken. And then you know the story. Satan comes to Eve and he lies to her and says, you know, didn't God say that you can't eat from any of the trees in the garden? And of course, God did not say that. He said that there was only one. So again, trying to minimize the temptation. See, it's just that one. It's no big deal. Everything else was within limits. So do whatever you want. Just that one tree. God did that because He wanted them to have a choice. He wanted them to choose to love Him. Then he says, Satan says, you know, God is lying to you. You're not going to die if you eat of the fruit of that tree. In fact, you'll be as wise as God. You'll be just like Him. You know, just about probably every single temptation comes down to that basic truth that we want to be in charge. We want to be God. Have you ever noticed that Satan never tempts us to be like him? Because he's evil. We would not want to be like him. But he tempts us to be like God. And Eve fell for that lie. So let me read you the story. It's in Genesis 3. We're going to pick up the story about verse 6. So Eve ate some of the fruit. Then she also gave some to her husband Adam, who was with her, and he ate it. Immediately their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. Now this is where shame enters the world. There had never been shame or any guilt or any fear prior to this point. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover up themselves, and then they heard the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from God among the trees. But God called out to Adam, "Where are you?" Adam replied, "I heard you coming, and I was afraid." Notice again, here is fear. "Because I was naked, so I hid." And God asked, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" Adam said, "You gave me this woman." Yeah, we see this movie here. "And she gave me the fruit, so I ate it." Then God said to Eve, "Why did you do this?" Eve replied, "The serpent deceived me and I ate it." So God said to Eve, "Because you disobeyed me," in other words, because you didn't do what I told you to do, now there's going to be a curse. Now everything is broken. One of the things that was broken was childbirth. And he said, "You'll have greater trouble in pregnancy and great pain in childbirth." How many of you are mothers? How many of you want to testify on this particular message? You can thank Eve for this. He said, "You're going to have trouble in pregnancy, great pain in childbirth, and though you'll desire your husband," in other words, even though you're still going to be in love with your husband, he is going to lord it over you. In other words, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be domination issues. There are going to be distractions. There's going to be a power struggle in your relationship from now on. Then God said to Adam, "Because you also disobeyed me and sinned with your wife, the ground you work is now cursed. And though you'll get to eat what you planted, your fields will have weeds and thorns and thistles." So we can thank Adam for the weeds in the world. And the rest of your life, you'll have to sweat and work hard to get your food until you yourself are returned to the dirt that I used to create you. Now, there are all kinds of spiritual truths in that passage. But I want to point out some of the relational truths that are in this story, because we see three fundamental fears that pop up, not just back then, not just in this story, but in every single one of our relationships as human beings. And you can see what we're going to look at today in your small group. You can see exactly what we're going to talk about today in your own marriage, and you can use it at work. You can do it with your friends. You can do it with your boyfriend or girlfriend. And these are three fundamental fears that started in that first relationship. And they're still present in your life and everybody's life. And they still damage and they destroy potential in our relationships. So let's get to it. How our fears ruin relationships. The first fear we learn is this. It's the fear of exposure. The fear of exposure makes me distant. Some of us have wondered, why can't I get close to other people? You know, I want to be close to my spouse. I want them to know me, to know who I really am. I want that intimacy with my spouse. That soul passionate intimacy that you have and are supposed to have in a marriage. Why can't I get close to the people in my life? Part of the reason is because of fear of exposure. Of being exposed makes me distant. And here's the truth. There's a lot in your life that you don't like. And you don't like it about you because it's stuff that is there. You see it and you're not happy with it. And you don't want to show it to anybody else. You don't want them to see it about you either. And And the things you don't accept about you, you have a fear will not be accepted by others, so you end up keeping your distance. Because when people get too close, they begin to see all of the problems. They see all of the flaws and the blemishes and the faults and the weaknesses. And as a result, we begin to pull back because we're not quite sure how they're going to respond to us with these problems in our lives. Those things that we don't even like about ourselves, let alone, if I were to share them with someone else, they might reject me and see who I really am and never want to have anything to do with me. The only reason they like me is because of who they think I am, not who I really am. Genesis 3, it says that God called Adam, "Why are you hiding?" And Adam said, "I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid." You know, let me just say this. Whenever God asks a question, He already knows the answer. He wasn't asking for his benefit. He was asking the question for Adam's benefit because he wants Adam to man up and to take responsibility for the fact that he had run and was hiding. I also want to say that any transformation in any area of your life, including your relationships, only will happen when you are ready to own up to the fact that things are not the way they ought to be. As long as you think, my life's fine, our marriage is great, there's no room for any improvement, we've got a perfect relationship. Guess what? Transformation will not happen. Because the reality is that, now, you may be able to look back in your life and say, oh my goodness, how far we have come. And that is completely true. But don't ever think that you're done. It is a lifelong process of becoming the person God wants us to be. And so we have to be able to look at our relationships and realize that I'm not quite there yet. There is still more that needs to be transformed inside of me. And part of that begins with me owning up and being honest to God and honest with myself that my relationships are not what they should be. They could be a whole lot better than they are right now. Now I want you to underline the phrase, I was afraid and I hid. Because they go together. I was afraid and I hid. Fear always causes us to run and hide. What are you hiding from because of your fear? What are you pretending isn't a problem in your life? What are you pretending isn't a problem in your relationships because you're afraid of facing the truth? Because God doesn't want us to fake it. He wants us to be honest and to face it when it comes to our fear. Now, Adam said, I was naked. What does it mean to be naked? It wasn't just a physical nakedness. There are plenty of ways that we become naked. Emotional nakedness. It just simply means that we're exposed, we're uncovered, we're vulnerable. It means that we're open and anybody can look and see who we really are. There's nothing to hide. When we're afraid of being that vulnerable, afraid of being that open and honest, afraid of letting people see us as we really are, that fear causes us to withdraw and to become distant. Because one of our deepest needs that every one of us has, we want and need to be loved. The problem is that we're afraid if I show you the real me, you won't love me. And I do know it is possible to be in a relationship, even a marriage for decades, 50 years, and still keep secrets from your spouse because you're afraid if they knew that part of your life, they wouldn't accept you. Living with somebody doesn't guarantee that they're seeing all that you are, because they're not. So the first fear is the fear of being exposed, and that causes me to be distant. The second fear we see in Adam and Eve is the fear of disapproval. The fear of disapproval makes me defensive. And now we move from simply hiding and running and covering up to now being defensive, and we start to attack other people. We're not just hiding, now we're accusing others. In this stage now, when I have the fear of disapproval, I start pointing fingers at everybody else. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. And I will tell you, the more critical a person is, the more you know they fear disapproval. I'll say that again. The more critical, the more perfectionistic, the more attacking somebody is, the more you know that person fears disapproval. Because that's the way it shows up. The more I fear disapproval in my life, the more I'm going to point the finger at everybody else and not at me. So you see so many of the commentators and preachers and other people out there who are pointing the wrongs at everybody else. They're afraid of being disapproved of themselves, and it's coming out in their judgmentalism. And we see that in verse 12. God asked, "Did you eat of the tree? Did you eat what I told you not to eat?" And Adam answered, he said, "You gave me this woman. She gave me the fruit, so I ate it." Now I want you to know, guys, Adam took it like a man. And he blamed the woman. And he's not just blaming his wife, he's blaming God. You gave me this woman. There's a sense here that if you hadn't given me this woman, you and me, God, we would be like this. There wouldn't be this problem right now, but you gave her to me. She messed it all up. So Adam's blaming not only Eve, he's blaming God, and he's passing the responsibility. And I'm sorry, ladies, but Eve ends up passing the responsibility as well. Eve said, "The serpent deceived me, and so I ate it." So Adam blames his wife and God. Eve blames the snake, and the snake didn't have a leg to stand on. Okay, so my fear of disapproval makes me defensive, and this happens in our marriage all the time. This is one of those that happens all the time. If anybody says to you, your wife says something to you, and you feel like that there's a hint that it's your fault, that there's disapproval, our natural reaction is to get defensive and either to explain it away, to attack back, well, what about you? Or to excuse it. Well, let me explain why it happened. And for far too many of us, we never take responsibility for any of our actions. Now, I listen to so many people who want to say, that's the problem with our world right now. Nobody wants to take responsibility for anything. And anytime you say that, you better look in the mirror. It is, because it starts right here. All of us do that. My fear of disapproval makes me defensive. My fear of exposure makes me distant. My fear of disapproval makes me defensive. But then there's a third fear that we see in Adam and Eve, and it's the fear of losing control. Whenever we feel like we're going to lose control, we become demanding. The result of Adam and Eve's sin is that they lost control. In fact, they lost control of everything. They lost control of their future in the garden. They lost control of their destiny. They got kicked out of paradise. They were totally out of control. And now they were feeling it. They weren't controlling anything at this point. And then in this situation, my fear of losing control makes me demanding. Now let me say it this way. The more out of control you feel, the more controlling you're going to become with everybody else. The more out of control you feel, the more controlling you become with everybody else. I start bossing everybody around. I start making demands. I start protecting myself. I start defending and demanding and even demeaning. I start dominating. The more insecure you are, the greater you have the need to get your way. I won't ask you to raise your hand because we all know this person. If you're a very secure person, you don't need to have your way all the time. It doesn't bother you. You don't have to have your way all the time because you feel secure. But if you're insecure, then you have to have your way all the time. And you fight for your way, and you push for your way, and you try to control your way. The more out of control you feel, the more controlling you become. And this happens in verse 16. God says to Eve, you will have yearnings for your husband. In other words, you are going to love your husband, even though you both messed up. But he will lord it over you. The Berkeley translation says, he will dominate you. This is where the war of the sexes began. Right there. All the misunderstanding between men and women and husbands and wives and boyfriends and girlfriends, all the confusion, all of the conflict, all the jockeying for position and power, it all goes back to this situation, this sin that entered the world. Now, many of us know it's not fun being in that kind of relationship where you're not cooperating together as a marriage, but literally there's a competition between you and your spouse. And you see it and you feel it all the time. Anything you can do, I can do better. Or because you did that, I'm now going to do this. And it's back and forth. Where you're not fighting each other. Wouldn't it be nice if you both were on the same team? And that it was you and me against the world and face anything together and we were strong. And we know deep down that's the way a relationship is supposed to be. And this not only goes on in marriages, it goes on at work, it goes on with our friends, it goes on in our families. There's a competition rather than a sense of being together. So what is the antidote that transforms a relationship and relieves those three fears? The fear of exposure, the fear of disapproval, the fear of losing control causes me to be distant and defensive and even demanding. There is only one antidote when it comes to fear, and it's love. You and I must learn to live in God's love. If there's a verse you ever wanted to memorize, this would be a good one. First half of this verse says, wherever God's love is, there is no fear. You would underline no fear. You want to get rid of fear in a relationship, you've got to get God's love. You want to get rid of fear in your career, God's love has got to be present. You want to get fear out of education or out of sports or anything else, there has to be God's love. Because wherever there is God's love, There is no fear. Why? It goes on to say, because God's perfect love drives out all fear. You know, the opposite of fear is not faith. The opposite of fear is love. And when you invite God's love into the front door of your heart, last week we talked about the heart being the center of our emotions. And when we ask God's love to come into our hearts, into that front door of our heart, fear goes out the back door, because fear and love can't live in the same house, because perfect love drives out all fear. Why is it that people will stand watching a house burn and just stand on the sidelines feeling afraid to go in, but then somebody runs in? It's the mother going in after her baby. Why? Because fear is overcome by love. She has to run because she loves her baby that much. The love is greater than the fear. And when the love is greater than the fear, then we are not distant. We are not demanding. We do not fear disapproval, and we take responsibility. I'm going to tell you this week, during your devotion time, we're going to look at some of the practical ways that we can learn to live in God's love. Because the reality is, we so desperately want that in our lives, but we can't figure out why we can't get there. And what's funny is how many people will come into my office and they'll say, the guy will say, you know, I want that kind of relationship, but she's the problem. I'm doing everything perfectly, but she's the problem. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. Far too many of us have ruined countless relationships because we ourselves are afraid of being exposed. We're afraid that we don't measure up. We're afraid of losing control. We're afraid that somebody's going to see the real us. We're afraid to take responsibility. The thing this week we're going to study is the fact God made us exactly who we are. And yes, we have a long way to go. Yes, we need to be transformed. Yes, He has placed us in relationships. Because of His love, we can find the strength in order to face every situation, every relationship, to be honest, and to take responsibility, and to realize I don't have to be in control all the time. God wants us to experience His unconditional love every day that we live, and to share that same love with others, and to realize that perfect love casts out all fear. So let me ask you, are you ready to stop being afraid? Do you need that kind of love in your life? Then let me ask you to bow your heads with me as we close. I want to invite you to pray this prayer with me. And even as I pray for myself, that you would join me in this prayer for myself and say that it is a prayer for you as well. That you say me too, God. God, I admit that I have made a mess in my relationships. They're complicated, they're broken, they're not the best. Too often I've settled for less than the best, and my relationships need to be transformed. So I'd like you to begin by changing me, to deliver me from these three fears that we've talked about today. Because, Lord, I can see how they make me distant and defensive and even demanding. So today and each day from now on, I want to surrender my heart to you. I want to learn to live my life in your love, filled with your love. And so please replace my shame with your love. And when I'm afraid to let others see the real me, remind me of how you see me. And I thank you, Lord, that you accept me completely, that you love me unconditionally, that you forgive me totally. God, help me to do the same for others. Help me to value others as much as you value me. God, I want to be known as a loving person. And I want to live my life in love. And I humbly ask this in Jesus' name.